Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and this is World History. Today we're going to talk about the founding of the Ottoman Empire and go through the first piece of Ottoman history to set the stage for one of the great empires that's really going to last until the 20th century. So let's talk a little bit about the Ottomans and why they became so influential. The Ottoman Empire is one of three quote unquote gunpowder empires that arose sort of across Eurasia in the 1300s. The basic thesis is that the Ottoman Empire, along with the Safavids and the Mughals, helped to use gunpowder weapons to conquer these vast territories. But as we dive into the history of each of these empires, of course, we're going to learn that it's more complicated than that gunpowder weapons were only one component of the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and it's really a system of wise rulership and an effective bureaucracy that led to the longevity of this great sort of successor to the Romans. So here's our objectives for today. We'll take a moment and move forward. So, the collapse of the Roman Empire was one of the components that led to the rise of the Ottoman Empire. As we hopefully know, Rome itself was sacked in the 400s. The Roman Empire at this point had been divided into East and West. The Eastern Roman Empire continued as the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about in a moment, whereas the Western Roman Empire collapsed into local rulers and a system of proto-feudalism that we've already kind of talked about when we were talking about Europe and the rise of the Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire had a recovery and really took over as the successors to the Romans in a lot of ways. Especially under Justinian with his general Belisarius, they were able to conquer Rome again and take back a significant amount of Roman territory. They became the heirs of sort of the Christian tradition, spreading Orthodox Christianity across these areas. They brought in, it's one of the cooler things is, of course, the bringing in of the elite Viking Guard, the Varangian Guard, that sort of became the sort of core warriors and then palace servants of the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, the great city of Constantinople is going to be one of these key pieces. When we talked about Islam, we talked about the importance of the city of Constantinople, of the Theodosian walls, and how this sort of indomitable fortress of Eastern Christianity would lead the Byzantine Empire to survive long beyond when it had any sort of real political or military influence. Specifically, the Theodosian walls, of course, were the great accomplishment of the city of Constantinople. This system of walls prevented the city from being taken with a traditional military assault and allowed far fewer defenders to fight off massive armies that would try to take this great city. The new inventions, such as Greek fire, also allowed the Byzantine navy to fight off a variety of different attacks, both from the Muslims and then eventually from the growing power of the Ottomans. And so a combination of ingenuity and architecture and really powerful defenses allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive for a very long time. But as we, of course, know, the Byzantine Empire went into decline. Economically, the Byzantine Empire began to be choked off by its neighbors as a variety of different trade routes surpassed it. The Crusades were a disaster for the Byzantine Empire, specifically, of course, the Third Crusade, which ended up sacking the great city of Constantinople. And the spread of Islam really weakened the power of the Byzantine Empire as the whirling dervishes sort of recruited and converted the population of Anatolia around the city of Constantinople to Islam, and it meant that the cultural, religious, and linguistic connections of the area around the Byzantine capital became much more centered towards both Damascus and then later Baghdad than the Byzantine Empire and Christianity in Constantinople. The founding of the Ottoman Empire was by a guy named Osman, who reportedly had this dream that he and his descendants would eventually create a great empire. He was one of just a bunch of different sort of Turkic peoples controlling Anatolia during this time. You could see the Byzantine Empire at this point has a tiny, tiny fraction of the territory they had previously. Osman did very little to expand his territory. He took over some of the land in Anatolia, but it really wasn't until his great-great-grandson ascended to the throne, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, that the Ottoman Empire really started taking off. Bayezid was a fierce and cunning warrior and an influential general. getting the nickname the Thunderbolts for his brave charges and the ability to disperse enemy forces. Bayezid began the conquest of Anatolia. He's also famous for establishing the devshirme, the system by which they recruited conquered peoples and put them into this system where they were given a series of exams, and then based on their skill in these exams, they would either be put into the normal army, into the elite Janissary Corps, or depending on their skill, they could become administrators, scientists, or teachers, things like that. And so conquered peoples would be then incorporated into the Ottoman society based on their skill and their abilities. And so this led to, of course, the Janissaries being an incredibly effective fighting force, and the Ottoman Empire having a relatively broad range of people with different skills to draw from, and then making sure that their bureaucracy is going to be somewhat efficient and ruled by people of skill. Here's a description of Ottoman bureaucracy. Take a moment, pause, and read. The meritocratic nature of the Ottoman system is one of the things that's going to lead the empire to survive a number of periods of decline and almost destruction. The devshirme itself leads to the creation of the Janissary Corps, which became the sort of heart of the Ottoman military. They would be placed right in the center of the Ottoman lines, taking the brunt of any enemy attack, and then would, of course, be the first ones to lead a counterattack. This idea of elite infantry being the core of your army was a complete change from the almost exclusively horse-based, sort of cavalry-based warfare that had dominated really since, the Mongol conquests and even before this. And so this military revolution where you're moving away from sort of mounted knights and to sort of elite infantry units, partially because of more powerful ranged weapons like muskets, but also partially because of new technology and new training and discipline and things like that. And so this, of course, just like in Europe, necessitated powerful states that could collect taxes in order to pay these people and cut down on the power of traditional nobles, increasing the power of rulers. So military revolution, part of this whole Ottoman Empire thing. Incorporating gunpowder weapons was, of course, an important part of the Ottoman rise. The Ottoman Empire would slowly expand, taking the territory both in Anatolia and in the Balkans and Greece, sort of surrounding the great city of Constantinople, and pushing up against the sort of great empires of the East. The use of cannons and then eventually muskets would have allowed the Ottomans to take down and to destroy walled cities, which is, of course, going to be a huge change because up to this point, walls were a great way of keeping cavalry at bay and making your city almost impregnable. And so all of this led to Ottoman expansion. The Ottoman Empire almost came to an end at the hands of Timur the Lame or Tamerlane. Bayezid lost the war against the Timurid Empire and was captured. This led to an almost collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and probably would have if Timur wasn't so busy and worried about trying to take over China and areas to the east. And so he left a rump state of the Ottoman Empire alone, despite having captured Bayezid. The Ottoman Empire went into decline, and it took about 3 generations for the Ottoman Empire to rebuild itself, mostly through the strength again of its bureaucracy, to the point in which it could actually re-expand. Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, was the Ottoman leader who expanded the empire and really helped to solidify its place in history by taking the great city of Constantinople. The building of massive cannons that could hurl rocks that weighed several tons into the Theodosian walls was absolutely essential in taking the great city of Christendom and bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire once and for all. Here's an account of the fall of Constantinople, and you can see, hopefully, the role of the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman soldiers, in this whole process. So take a moment, pause, and read, and we'll move on. The city of Constantinople, when it fell, became the center of the Ottoman Empire. The city itself, once the great citadel of Christendom, now became one of the most important cities in Islam. The Hagia Sophia, the great church of the Byzantine Empire, became a mosque. The Ottoman Empire and this became sort of the center of trade, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, as the place, the geographic position of Constantinople is incredibly important. And the Ottoman Empire took over as far as the great sort of trading empires between Asia, South and East Asia, and Europe and Africa. And all of this led to the rise in prestige of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans traveled across Europe and mapped out the various borders of Europe, as well as having connections across to Asia. And all this trade brought in spectacular wealth to Ottoman society, leading them to become one of the world's leading empires. The Ottoman Empire relied on a system called the Millet System, in which they would, on the one hand, of course, allow non-Muslims to practice their faith within Muslim territory, as long as they paid the jizya or the tax. Each of these millets functioned somewhat similarly to how the satraps functioned back in the Persian Empire, in that each of these groups could govern themselves, rule their own affairs, as long as they provided children and people. They provided people for the devshirme to be able to fill out the Ottoman military and bureaucracy, and as long as they continued to pay taxes to the empire. They also had the ability to go and petition the Sultan in order to get their issues addressed. And so once a year, they could then send a representative to the Sultan, speak to him directly, and then hopefully that would allow him to understand what the various people of his empire wanted. And so this system of toleration and self-government meant, on the one hand, the people were relatively satisfied with Ottoman rule, but on the other hand, the Ottoman Empire had limited ability to truly project power into a lot of the areas that they conquered. And so there's real questions as far as how cohesive the governmental systems of these empires were. Here's a takeaway or a basic impression of Ottoman law. So take a moment, pause, and read. This idea of incorporating in various diverse groups of people into these multinational empires is going to be really one of the central themes that we look at in this course going forward. So here's the way the Ottomans did it. Let's move on. Trade, of course, brought massive wealth to the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottomans were sort of positioned in between Europe and Asia. And so they would benefit from being able to tax a lot of the goods coming through. Especially as we talked about in the European Renaissance, they became more interested in trade and ideas coming through these areas. And especially once we get to the age of exploration and Europeans get a taste for things like tea and silk and goods like that. A lot of those goods coming through the Ottoman Empire led to spectacular wealth. The Ottoman government itself became known as the Sublime Porte. This was because of the bureaucracy, because of the fabulous palace complex. They were able to centralize all government affairs in the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. And this gave the Sultan and his advisors and viziers substantial power and control over sort of the day-to-day workings of the Ottoman government. When people from all over the world came to Constantinople, they were wowed by the opulence, the architectural techniques, the fabulous wealth and beauty of the great city of Constantinople. And so the Ottoman Empire really stood out as one of the places that was, in the 14 and 1500s, really the centers of human civilization. Selim the Grim expanded the empire even further. Also known as Selim the Resolute, he had a fierce temper and was a very, very skilled warrior. He expanded the empire down into Egypt, connecting the Ottomans with trade routes across the Sahara Desert, bringing in valuable African trade goods, and Egypt became the breadbasket of the empire. Egyptian wheat would feed the growing Ottoman armies as they continued to expand, and allowed the empire to free up other areas for cash crops and things like that. And so the Ottoman Empire greatly grew in wealth and importance with the incorporation of Egypt, although the Ottomans always struggled to project power because of the Mamluks in Egypt, the sort of powerful Muslim slave administrators that had always controlled that province. And so there's going to be significant tension between Constantinople and the great Egyptian cities. And so this is going to be one of our themes of the Ottoman Empire too, is they control Egypt, but like really projecting power into Egypt is going to be a struggle for Ottoman sultans. The Ottomans also take the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. With the taking of the great Muslim holy cities, the Sultan Selim took on the position of caliph, or head of the Islamic Church. So to some degree, the Ottoman sultans now become sort of the heirs of the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates, and they become the heads of Sunni Islam. Salim also persecuted Shiites throughout his kingdom and, to some extent tried to, although he provided a lot of religious tolerance to non-Muslims, to non-Orthodox Muslims, his rule was relatively brutal as he tried to consolidate religious power over his empire. There were, of course, other Muslim rulers that we're going to be talking about here going forward. So you, of course, also have the Safavids and the Mughal rulers, who also, to some degree, claimed the title of caliph. But the Ottoman Sultan becomes one of the key leaders of the Muslim world. So that brings us to the conclusion of this lesson. We'll get to the third, fourth, and fifth objectives for the Ottoman Empire tomorrow as we talk about the rise of Suleiman the Magnificent and then the sort of stagnation of the Ottoman Empire. So hopefully you can answer the first two objectives for today, and then we'll come back tomorrow and move our story of the Ottomans forward. Thank you for listening.